Hi, my name's David Hughes, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you on behalf of APO and also Agribusiness Academy. Topic for me today is how coronavirus, COVID-19, will impact the opportunity landscape for the Asian agri-food sector. Let me just get bang into my presentation. I always like to start with the big picture, and the big picture is our world and the people within our world. Without consumers, we have no business. And look, by 2050, we will have 10 billion people living in our world, and 80% of them will live in Asia and Africa. That's astonishing. We're going to add 2 billion people over the next 30 years, let's say. But if we look at 2020, intriguingly, particularly from outside Asia, it always surprises people when they notice that actually the globe is predominantly Asian. So 60% of the population of the world this year live in Asia. As we move forward over the next 30, actually the proportion that Asian will take will decline slightly because of the accelerated increase in population from Africa. Why do I start with population? Because if we're going to add 2 billion, it asks the question, will we produce enough food for them? And my view would almost certainly yes. If I reflect back, let's go back to 1975, so that's 45 years ago. The population of this world was 3.8 billion. That's less than half of what it is now. And back in 1975, the view was we would not be able to produce enough food for what was coming, this huge increase in population. We did, and what did it reflect? An astonishing productivity performance right across the global food industry. And it wouldn't surprise me in the least to see this continue over the next 30 years. Intriguingly for me, I talk all around the world, is that particularly when I'm in the West, there's a view that it's a great shame that our world in terms of food is becoming westernized. I think people take that view because they see McDonald's cropping up everywhere, KFC, Pizza Huts in China, right across the world. But for me, actually, I don't think the world's food is being westernized. If anything, it's being Asianized, or at least a Western view of what Asian food is. For example, here's from the US Green Giant, a Buddha bowl, a pad thai bowl, a fried rice bowl, a ramen bowl. In my own market, Asian food and food in bowls are hugely on trend. Itsu, very successful food service chain, which is Japanese type food, if you will. So the world is looking to Asia for food styles. I think that's good for the Asian food industry. Let's just reflect a little too on what's happened to global food prices. I check every month, as one should, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, Global Food Price Index. And this is a long series here going back to 1960. I mean, for goodness sake, that's 60 years ago, all the way up to this very day. And what do we see? That back in about 1973, 74, food prices peaked. And the view then, and I was around then, was that we were going to see accelerated food prices right across the globe, and that Malthus, that man who thought that population globally would be controlled by our access to food and that would decrease population, was wrong, quite wrong. And what we've seen, if you take the longer term view, is that the relative price of food has remained pretty stable. Every now and again we get peaks, but if I look back over the last better part of 10 years, global food prices have declined, which is perhaps surprising as we see this population burst. Moving on. But I think we have particular challenges. Will we be able to maintain this productivity improvement for agriculture, for the food industry in general? And what are the risks? Well, the risks relate to, not least, the prospect of climate change. Here we are, 2019, last year, second hottest year on record for the Earth. Let's take on the right-hand side here, across Arctic Canada, ice levels, sea ice levels are at record lows. This is sort of worrisome. Moving on, every Saturday I read my Economist, And back a few months ago, I really enjoyed looking at this. This is what's happened to global temperatures all the way from 1840 to the present time. So that's over, 160 years, whatever, 180 years. And what we see is that increasingly it's got warmer, blue cold, redder, warmer. We see just increasing global warmth. This must be an issue from an agricultural productivity point of view. What's more, let's go back to just January of this year. We have the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. It's where the big boys and girls of this world, whether it be government or big food firms and big firms in general, all get together to look at what they're facing. Actually, what they missed was the coronavirus epidemic. But if we look here, what were they saying? If you went back 5 years ago in the World Economic Forum, they said, what are the big risks for business looking forward? And it was about interstate conflict. It was about failure of national governments. Now let's accelerate through to 2020, and it's become increasingly green. And green isn't good in this regard, because their view is, the big boys and girls view of the world is that there is increasing risk from extreme weather, from climate action failure, from national disasters, from biodiversity loss, and human-made environmental disasters. I think we've got to keep our eye on that, because that will be the real challenge for agriculture going forward. And if I look right across the globe, what do I notice in terms of a mega trend? It's this notion of climate-friendly and planet-friendly diets are gaining substantial traction. And who's driving this? I suggest you ask your children, ask your grandchildren, and you can see it. The principal player in this, of course, is the Swedish girl, I think she's 16 or 17, Greta, who's made such an impact. I won't be silenced when the world is on fire. Is this a Western thing? Not at all. Look, student climate strikes across Asia. There is no planet B. We have to deal with planet A. Youth climate strikes sweep Asia ahead of UN Climate Action Summit. And I think from an Asian food industry point of view, we've got to look at our food product offer and say, are they planet friendly? Are they climate friendly? This is hugely important. And it's not just our children and grandchildren, that if we look at the United Nations, individual governments say we must change what we eat, because in this particular case, plant-based diets are key in tackling climate change, says the UN. Across to Europe, a sustainability charge for meat is being debated. That is, a meat tax is possible in Europe, where the view is that the impact of meat production on climate change is not positive, is negative, and therefore we have to consume less meat. This is sort of controversial, I would think, from an Asian point of view, where meat consumption, particularly in emerging markets, is relatively low. So there are big forces pushing this climate-friendly, planet-friendly diets. And what I notice, again, I read a great deal because I need to in my line of work, is that increasingly around the world and in major media, we see more and more stories about food, and they're often negative. So here we are, not enough pork in the world to deal with China's demand for meat as a result of the, well, it could be right across Asia, of the African swine fever. What about, here we're on the right-hand side, it's this sort of fake meat, as they say in the US. Again, it become a headline. Fishing, there are issues here. Global fishing fleets waste 10% of their catch. So here we are in the food industry, agriculture and food industry, and increasingly we are in the headlines of the world. And again, I think that brings opportunities and also threats. So what about necessary changes in the food system? Here I'm using some Rabobank data, and they're saying, look, we must have healthier diets, again, picking up on this theme of lower impact diets. We have to consume less, even in emerging countries where you're seeing incomes increase and people changing what they eat, perhaps trading up to higher protein foods. But in every Asian country, you can see this growing overconsumption of food. So healthier diets, more responsible use of resources, really important here. Lower rates of waste and loss along the supply chain. What one tends to see globally is that in higher income countries, most of the food wastage and loss is at the consumer level, where they overbuy and then throw out. In emerging markets, most of the loss is along the supply chain, where there is poor infrastructure, which doesn't allow the good flow of products through the chain. And then on the fourth end, the bottom quadrant, we must have a lower negative impact on planet and indeed people. This whole notion of treading more lightly on our very fragile Earth. Here I've looked at what do Temasek have to say, the Temasek Foundation, of course, partly financed by the Singapore government. And what did their former chairman say? We're at the beginning of the fourth agricultural revolution. And what are the key drivers of the fourth agricultural revolution? One, the changes in R&D related to the microbiome. I mean, an example of that would be, one would expect to see going forward, I don't know, that crops, that regular cereal crops, we have an opportunity now to make them nitrogen fixing. And so they will bring a reduction, if you will, in the use of fertilizer. Precision agriculture, again, right across the world. Doesn't have to be just a developed world thing. That from a farming perspective, we expect to see technological improvements that relate to precision agriculture. In this little example here, you can see the drone, and we'll see this right across the world. Gene editing, it's controversial, this, of course, you know, the whole idea of genetic modification. But if you look at, say, CRISPR technology, then it seems to be a technology which is more acceptable to consumers. And on the right-hand side, this move towards alternative protein, which is a big push forward in developed markets, but I see it getting traction too in emerging markets. So what about genetic modification? We're starting to see cracks in the wall of those who are trying to stop it advancing. I was pleased to see golden rice approved for sale and seen as safe for consumption in the Philippines. Indeed, there are many who will say that if we disallow golden rice, then that's immoral, that there are children who will be born and will have to face blindness issues because of poor nutrition, and that golden rice can address this. Moving on, there's a global trend that I notice, whether it be in emerging markets or developed markets, where increasingly consumers want to know, where did my food come from? Who produced it? How did they produce it? They want to see transparency and traceability in the supply chain. And why? Because that knowledge of origin gives reassurance of quality and safety. And what we see here in this example is that technology being used to provide that reassurance. So here's IBM, for example, a tech giant, using blockchain technology to be able to follow from the cup of coffee I'm just about to drink all the way back down the supply chain to the small-scale farmer in, say, Vietnam, so that from a consumer point of view, I can see how the product reached me. Mars in chocolate and with cocoa are doing exactly the same across the world. And I just think we'll see more and more of that. Moving on. Here's another example of the use of technology, particularly as it relates to agriculture, where we've got in the US a crop company with a ultra-high soy protein, leveraging plant genomics to drive ingredient innovation. And this is just so increasing the protein content of soy itself. And you can see the implications that would have, terrific in terms of adding soy protein productivity production. Moving on. Here's another issue. And increasingly I note again across the world that consumers are concerned about social issues, and not least about pollution and its impact that it has on oceans, or indeed on just the climate in general. And the example I've given here is that a recent work by the TIA Fund looking at the impact of plastic pollution, specifically by 4 companies, Nestle, Unilever, Coca-Cola, and PepsiCo, where they're saying these 4 leading brands, they have 500,000 tons of plastic pollution a year. And I might say the majority of the world's plastic pollution is in Asia. So here's an issue seen by consumers. Is there a technological response? Yes, there is. If we take bioplastic rivals, these are competing companies, BASF and Novamont, and both independently unveiling compostable cling films in fundamental breakthroughs of plastic technology. Moving on. And I notice again that whether it be in North America or indeed in Asia, there is increasing interest in this concept of regenerative agriculture. So what's that all about? It's about agriculture where once we've reduced crops, that the soil is in as good, if not better health than when we started. And I think, again, consumers are starting to relate to this. They want to know, how was it produced? We want to know, did you benefit the climate? Did you benefit the producer? Did you benefit the soil? In this particular case, it's Danone, who are leading an alliance with DSM, which is a major ingredient company, but also with Farming for Generations. A range of companies are doing more work here. So again, I'm sort of ever conscious, are these sort of technological movements or these sort of global trends, are they more indicative of what's happening in North America or Europe? Not at all. If we look at this sort of increasing consumer interest in plant-based foods, which has been huge in North America and Europe, but I see it gaining traction now in Europe. Here's Future Foods, that's Future with a PH, creating a plant-based pork substitute in the Asian market, for example. And again, this isn't a great technological breakthrough, but if we look at the expansion of meat protein production and consumption, not least in Asia, then one wonders, have we got the capacity around the world to produce the soy or the protein as feed? And what we've seen emerging is new agri-protein, if you will, based on insects. I've taken 2 examples here, mealworm, which is the flower beetle from France, black soldier flies from South Africa. And I would suggest, again, if we move forward 5-10 years, that a important component of chicken, of pork, of aquaculture, basa feed will be insects. Great for the environment. This is a really efficient way to produce protein feed, particularly for livestock. Okay, look, just before we get into specific coronavirus issues, I think we should just look at consumer trends and Asia. And what I notice, here we are, Asia mega cities over time. If we went back to 1985, 35 years ago, that's the picture on the left-hand side. Yes, we had mega cities in 1985, but look at the explosion of these, particularly in Asia, by 2030. Huge cities with 20, 30, maybe even 40 million people. That's the same size as countries. And the most influential consumers in these big cities right now are millennials. These are consumers who are between 20 and 40. I have a particular interest in these because I think that group, who increasingly are educated, they're influential in terms of driving consumer trends. And what's more, they're well connected. Here we are, the example from Vietnam, that millennials in Vietnam are just as likely to have connections in New York as they will do in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. So that's an influential group who are changing the way that they eat and what they want to eat, and we have to listen to them, I would suggest. If we look at what's happened most recently with regard to this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, if you will, it's sort of really intriguing across Asia, where in history, Asia has been a great region for eating out of home. And of course, what's happened with the pandemic is that, for good reason, because of lockdowns and I can't leave my house, that households have had to actually eat more at home. And what's more, they say they'll continue to do this once the pandemic has gone. You can see particularly in the Chinese mainland, but also South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. And we can see this emergence in the supply chain. Okay, I'm going to cook more at home, but I don't have the time to go out and shop for the ingredients. And so we see in China, for example, Miss Fresh, which is like many companies you can see in Europe and North America, where they will supply boxes of ingredients for specific recipes going towards households on a weekly basis. So it's a change in the dynamics, again, of the food chain. As I said, Asia have always been very, very strong. Countries in Asia have been very strong in food service. And I just have two examples here. On the right-hand side, Line Man. So now from Thailand, of course, where you can see this home delivery. So yes, I'll eat at home, but no, I won't cook at home. Or on the left-hand side, I've used Jollibee, where it's a sort of interesting example how an Asian fast food chain has gone international. It's growing in Asia and it's setting its sights on North America. Here's an example of how it's expanding its business in Vietnam. So what about consumers? And again, this COVID-19, this pandemic, how is it changing the way they view food? Well, 90% close to said they'd be more willing to buy daily necessities and fresh products online after the pandemic. And again, I think you can link this to these mega cities. If you're living in a mega city, if you have the income, then will you be shopping in local wet markets and in traditional retail? Increasingly, they're saying, just send it home. And what's more, I think increasingly, again, going through this pandemic, 80%, 8 out of 10 people said they're going to pay particular attention to eating healthily after the pandemic. They've always wanted health, but now it's right on their mind. Again, let's use a Vietnamese example here. What are the top 3 household concerns in Vietnam? Actually, pre-pandemic, this is last year, market research. Food safety, always an issue in Asia. Health and wellness, yep. And environmental issues and disease. And that will influence what, how, and where consumers buy. Again, I do a lot of work in Thailand, and I'm intrigued. Here's some key statistics on health challenges in Thailand. That close to 1/3 of the population in Thailand are overweight. 25% of the population suffer from raised blood pressure. 11% of the adults are obese. And yet we think of Asians in general as being, certainly relative to so-called Western consumers, much slimmer. But this sort of overconsumption, you can see, has got traction, and it must change. And I think people are coming to terms with it, say we must eat more healthily. And that's really important for us in the food industry to recognize. I mentioned to this sort of move to online grocery shopping, and here's just some statistics for Asia. And you can see this line of JD.com, Alibaba, Ocean Group, 7-Eleven, Lotte Shopping. It's just the top 10 online grocery retailers in Asia, and they expect to see massive growth over the next 5 years, 3 years, in fact, compound growth rates of into the 20s. They'll change the nature of food supply chains in Asia. But it's not just about online. So if they do shop online, they'll still continue to shop in traditional shops, but more likely in convenience stores that are right next to them. Again, I would suggest if you look at the success of 7-Eleven right across Asia, huge growth. And so it's this sort of bipolar. On the one hand, I'll shop online. On the other, I'll shop right next door to where I live. So we see this accelerated evolution of the supply chain. I think what's exciting in Asia is that the use of technology across the supply chain, and particularly at retail, again, is accelerating the evolution of changes in the supply chain. I mean, I don't go to Europe or North America to see theater, to see great technological developments in retail. I go to Asia, and that will continue. So to finish off here, what are some top of mind thoughts for me on the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on the global agriculture and food industry? For my mind, the biggest impact is the prospect of global recession increasing. Look, if we in 2020 and 2021, it is very likely we'll see a global recession. I think on the positive side, it's likely to be less in Asia because I think Asian economies will recover quicker than those in Europe and North America. But irrespective, as household incomes decrease or under pressure, you'll see increasing demand for staples, for rice, for the basic foodstuffs of our country. And it will decrease demand for premium foods. Currently, and thank goodness, there's no link between COVID-19 and food and its packaging. That means people aren't sort of worried about picking up the virus when they buy a food item. They're more worried about picking up the virus from other people. But I think possible supply chain slowdowns are inevitable because of food safety checks at the border. That for countries, like all countries who are importing food, they'll just be increasingly careful about what they're importing and checking. That will just slow down the velocity of moving food around the world. I think in general, global food supply chains are robust, particularly for longer shelf life commodities. But again, we'll see increasingly frequent supply disruptions. We've already seen it last year with African swine fever, these reoccurring avian influenza. But as we know, because of climate change, etc., floods, droughts, having an impact on basic agriculture. And also, here we are in mid-pandemic, if you will, for the COVID-19. And what it's bringing is labor shortages, particularly in higher income countries, constraining supplies of, for example, hand-picked horticultural crops. I do a lot of work in New Zealand. New Zealand has an excellent export market in cherries, apples, berries into Asia, but they're running out of labor and they're constrained in terms of bringing in labor from Asia, actually, to pick New Zealand crops to then export to Asia. And I expect to see more of that. And it, of course, what it will bring is accelerated investment, accelerated R&D, research and development in robotics. See that, as I've already mentioned, right across agriculture. We're in mid-pandemic. Actually, if you look in China, maybe in South Korea, we've moved past mid and moving towards the end of at least this initial pandemic, and it's causing food processing disruptions. Let me go to the US, where two of the largest meat companies in the world, JBS and Tyson, are closing plants because of labor shortages. If we have full-on COVID-19, that will have an impact on the availability of labor within food processing, because food processing in general is labor intensive. I think, as we know, there are concerns in Asia about food safety, and what this will do is drive accelerated declines in the wet markets, in the traditional markets, as the principal source of supply for fresh foods. And it may well bring more regulation and reduced consumer demand for street-served foods. I think that's a shame in some respects, but I see it as being inevitable. There are much longer-term concerns about food safety and particularly food security, and that drives consumer and government interest in increasing supply for local and domestically produced foods, where they say we need to up our self-sufficiency in food in case there is an issue in other parts of the world. I've already mentioned accelerated adoption of online grocery shopping and also the increasing interest in very local convenience stores, particularly in mega cities with traffic problems. And we're seeing and have seen concerns about shortages and occasional panic buying. Whenever we get pandemics, this will happen and it leads to greater food wastage. Why? Because people overbuy and then they can't consume. And of course, as we've seen across Asia and certainly in the US and Europe now, if you close down the restaurants and fast food outlets, it encourages increased home cooking and modern meal delivery businesses. This is a sort of fundamental issue for the restaurants and the cafes of the world, who suddenly have been just shut out of the food industry. It's a huge business for them. So there we are. Some thoughts on COVID-19 and its pandemic. May it end quickly. It's here I am talking to you from my office in the UK, and I'm shut up at home and I want to get out. I wish you well, and thank you very much for listening.